like to welcome you all here to the presentation. I'm Robin Davis, and seeing you all here reminds me of, there was an atheist who was walking in the woods one day, and he was admiring the trees, the sunshine filtering through the leaves, the babbling brook alongside, and he said, "Oh, what a wonderful scene this is." And then he heard a rustling in the trees behind him, and there was a big grizzly bear that came up the path after him. And he started running, and he ran faster and faster, but the grizzly got closer and closer. And the man tripped and fell down, and as he fell down, he cried out, "Oh God!" And suddenly the scene froze, and the brook stopped, the bear paused mid-action, and a voice came from on high saying, "After all these years of denying my existence and of teaching other people that I don't exist, are you now crying out to me?" And the atheist thought for a minute. He thought, I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to live and die consistent. So he said, no. I'm not going to become a Christian, but could you make the bear a Christian? So the scene came to life again, and the bear folded his paws and said, "For the food I am now about to receive, I'm truly thankful." Well, I hope you're thankful too, and Lord, thank you for this food that Jackie Bynum and the crew has prepared for us. Thank you for the students, and pray for your presence with us during this next hour. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I want to make sure everybody has filled out the IRB form, the informed consent. 2 copies, your name and your date. That's paperwork that I have to submit. And then hang on to your number, because you're going to use that same number on the post-test that we'll give you at the end of the presentation. This is an anonymous event, so I will not know when I read your thing who filled out what, and I don't know your handwriting. So, does anybody have any questions before we get going? Yeah. 2 copies of the IRB, right. And then there's a little clip, so you can, if you want, you can clip everything together and turn it in. You don't need your number. Don't put your number on your IRB form, okay? Because that has your name on it, and I don't want any record of who, that Jennifer is number whatever.
So we have to sign with both copies?
Yes, 2 copies. So I have to keep a copy, and then I have to submit a copy. It's just so that you are protected from, the seminary wants to protect the students from anything that might be psychologically harmful. So, okay, let's get going. So we had a national election a couple of days ago, and our media is full of news of how we're divided and polarized as a country. Americans are divided in many ways. We're divided over politics. We're divided between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, red states and blue states, urban and rural. Gender divisions between men and women are a large part of this division. We have the Women's March 2 years ago, women protesting the election of Donald Trump. And we have division in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein scandal that broke a year ago, and the ever-growing list of men who have been accused of sexually harassing women. We have women's responses in the Me Too movement, women all over the U.S. coming forward to say that they, too, have been victims of sexual harassment or abuse. And this abuse has reached the highest levels and is being revealed in the sex abuse scandals embroiling the Roman Catholic Church, male priests sexually abusing boys and adolescents, primarily male but also female, and the almost violent protests from some women that erupted over Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court. Now, as I've worked on this project, I'm in a Doctor of Ministry program under Dr. Alice Matthews, And as I've worked on this project, I've been observing the news, looking at whether it's the Boston Globe, TV, or online news, and a few gender issues dominate the public conversation. The top gender issues right now are harassment and abuse, where men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. Sometimes it's men who are the victims. And the ongoing, very hot-button issue of abortion, women demanding the right to abortion and fearful that this right will be threatened. And we have regular features in the news and in the paper on the earnings gap between men and women, or other ways that women are disadvantaged relative to men. So there are more college presidents in Massachusetts who are men than women. So that's the kind of thing that is making the news. Now, in the church, the dominant gender issue in the conservative Christian community is what can women do in the church today, in church leadership. There's stacks of books written on both sides of this issue, and in my program, I read stacks of books on both sides. But what occurred to me is that the gender conversation is so dominated by a few issues, which often put men in a bad light or pit men against women and in a competitive or adversarial relationship. And these conversations effectively squeeze out attention to other important gender issues that affect many women and that squeeze out attention being given to issues that affect men. So I see that men and women are looking at one another oftentimes across a great divide, with seeing one another as adversaries. So I'd like in my project today, and what I'm trying to do, is to promote areas of gender conversations, to promote mutual understanding and sympathy by promoting awareness of one another's hardships and sufferings, and promoting equality of attention, men aware of women's hardships, women aware of men's hardships, where we focus on hardships where one sex isn't having to take the blame for the other sex's hardships. So this is my current title of my thesis project, Raising Men's Awareness of Women's Hardships and Women's Awareness of Men's Hardships. So, and here's the biblical foundation of what I think we should be doing in the church and in the wider society. But God has so composed the body, that's the church, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. My hope is that as we have more awareness for one another's hardships, it will translate into our hearts, and I hope make us more compassionate for that man or that woman. And then will that compassion in our hearts translate into concrete action day to day? Will we do anything differently? Will men and women find a sympathetic welcome in our Christian communities, not a finger pointing because you are a man and men abuse women, or blaming women because they do something to men? So not blaming or guilting people for the offenses of their sex. Now, when we think of hardships of women, given the news over recent weeks, how can we not think of the following: sexual harassment and abuse? Now, we briefly mentioned sexual harassment, which has been the dominant gender issue, at least in my opinion, over the past year. And we certainly have sympathy for those who have been abused by others. And this hardship is well represented in the media, and I'm not going into that issue because I'm trying to look at lesser known or underrepresented hardships. So things that aren't talked about as much. Now, is it possible that there are men out there deserving our sympathy too?
not sympathy for men who are abusers, but are there ways that men, too, experience hardships that deserve sympathy? So let's start with a hardship that the majority of Americans experience, both men and women. I wonder if you can guess before I do it, but you don't have to say it. We don't have time for a conversation, I'm sorry. But overweight and obesity, something that creeps up on us as the majority of us Americans, and my whole project is the American context, so I'm not prepared to talk about, for example, obesity in maybe the countries where you're from, but I know worldwide it's an increasing problem. So men and women can understand one another's struggles in this area as it's a problem that both sexes face. So 71% of men are overweight or obese. 58, yeah. 50, okay, you're laughing, yeah. I've looked at this for so long, I don't laugh anymore, but 58% of women are overweight or obese, and almost 2/3 of all Americans are overweight or obese. So that's most of us. Most of us in the country are overweight or obese. So can we have sympathy for our fellow Americans, our friends, our neighbors, our family members, ourselves too, sympathy for ourselves too, who are suffering because of our obesity epidemic? So what I'm looking at here is a hardship that both men and women face. We both face this hardship. And to try and develop compassion in our hearts for people who are struggling with this hardship. So this shows Americans over time from 1960 to 2010. Men are the top line and women are the bottom line. So you see a woman in 2010 weighs what a man did in 1960. So it's just gone in one direction. We've been gaining significant weight. Now, in part, that's a sign of our affluent society. We have abundant food, abundant resources. We're really blessed in that regard. But one of the hardships that overweight people face is snap judgments that people make. Lookism is the term. Do we have a bias against people because of their weight? Lookism is discrimination or prejudice against people based on their appearance. Lookism can affect people's opportunities in the workplace and in social situations if they're perceived as unattractive. Lookism is one of the most pervasive but denied prejudices. Here's one, heightism. It's another heightism that short people experience. Discrimination against individuals based on their height. Some men face this hardship both in the workplace and in attracting women. Women have a statistical preference for tall men. And height-based prejudice permeates employment decisions, perhaps as much as race and gender. Now, do you think when this man looks in the mirror, he is experiencing a hardship? This is Prince William a few years ago, and now. All right, with a little titter of laughter. We're going to look now at some hardships that affect one sex more than the other, okay? So balding, there's a gender gap in balding. Have you ever thought of balding as a hardship of men? You know, you women, our hair thins as we age, but, you know, most women still have hair all over their whole head. So the most common form of hair loss, pattern balding, can afflict both women and men, but it's a very noticeable hardship, more so for men. Men usually bald in a noticeable pattern. Some men take losing their hair in stride, but for other men, balding is a source of considerable psychological stress and repercussions. It can be a very sensitive matter as they see themselves looking older, feeling less attractive, and very little they can do about it. We've looked at the hardships of overweight and obesity, which affect both men and women, heightism and balding, which affect primarily men. Now we're going to look at some other areas where women suffer disproportionately in this, and in the second half we'll look at where men suffer disproportionately. And I'm focusing primarily on hardships that are measurable with objective data. and where we're not blaming one sex for the hardship that another one is suffering. So we'll start with some of the bodily hardships that women experience just by virtue of being women. Now, whether or not you have children, as we look around the room, we see that every person here was given birth to by a woman. Human civilization on our planet would cease if women stopped having children. So the reproductive cycle, childbearing, child rearing are fraught with many potential hardships. Each of these categories represents potentially immense hardships for the women experiencing them. Now, the reproductive part of a woman's life may cover about 40 years, give or take. So let's quickly look at a number of potential hardships of women in this area of their lives. The menstrual cycle, 5 days or so every month for 40 years, except when a woman is pregnant or nursing a baby. There are hormonal fluctuations that can affect some women in a significant way. They can bring on debilitating symptoms from, or bothersome symptoms from acne to an upset stomach to an increase in intense emotions. Some women experience debilitating physical and emotional effects, PMS, premenstrual syndrome, for example. Pregnancy is accompanied with a lot of pain and hardships. Nausea, constipation, headaches, hemorrhoids, heartburn, leg cramps, lower back pain, excessive weight gain, fatigue, gestational diabetes, and even carpal tunnel syndrome. Now, most women don't have most of those, but these are some side effects of pregnancy. Now we get to labor, which I've gone through 5 times, but anyway, you can have premature rupture of the membranes when the mother's water breaks too soon, post-term pregnancy and post-maturity, pregnancy that continues longer than normal, sometimes causing problems for the baby, abnormal position and presentation of the baby, baby's coming out chin first or feet first, or the neck is funny. Our grandson was born that way. He had to come out C-section. Multiple births, such as twins or triplets, which are increasingly common now. Eclampsia, preterm labor due to an incompetent cervix. Our next-door neighbor baby was born because of that. Prolapsed umbilical cord, excessive uterine bleeding at delivery, uterine rupture, and fetal distress. I'm sorry all this is over your lunch, but here's another hardship, cesarean section. Now 32% of all American babies are born in 2015 via C-section, up from 1 in 18 in 1970. So many people are concerned about this high, what they consider an excessively high rate. But it can be life-saving for the mother and for the baby, but it is a hardship for the woman because her recovery is more difficult. She's in the hospital longer, more subject to infection because she's been cut open. And since a C-section often follows unexpected problems during delivery, the experience can be traumatic for her and for her husband. Here's a very great hardship, miscarriage and stillbirth. Miscarriage is the loss of a baby before 20 weeks. Stillbirth is the death of a baby after 20 weeks, up through delivery. Miscarriage is one of the most frequent problems of pregnancy, a hardship never to be minimized with a woman or her husband with comments like, oh, you're young, you can have another. It requires our deepest sympathy and compassion. For many women, infertility is a hardship that's very real and very painful. Sometimes the problem can be diagnosed as the woman's problem, sometimes the man's problem, sometimes a combination or unknown. It's a hardship that's often silently and invisibly borne, which can also be very hard. Now let's look first at the hardship that the husband, the prospective father, may be suffering. Sometimes there's a problem involving his sperm. Researchers tell us that sperm counts in men from the US, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, I'm sorry I don't have Asia here, have dropped by more than 50% in fewer than 40 years. So You get that? 50% drop in 40 years. They also said the rate of decline is not slowing. So this should be an urgent wake-up call for researchers and health authorities around the world to investigate the cause of this sharp and ongoing drop. Here's another problem. Sometimes the sperm can be misshaped and something that the man has absolutely no control over. Now, testosterone levels decline as men age, but a Massachusetts study concluded that recent years have seen a substantial but as yet unrecognized age-independent population level decrease in testosterone level in America. Okay, men's testosterone level has been declining, and they don't know the reason. So those are some invisible hardships of men that you would never know just without doing some reading. Now, not every woman dealing with infertility is so blessed, but here's an infertility story in my family. In this case, it's a success story. After a long and very high-tech journey, our niece Catherine, her husband Mark, and my first great niece, little Amelia Kathleen, who recently celebrated her second birthday. Catherine, my niece, has helped me understand close up the pain of infertility. Here's another problem, secondary infertility. That's the inability to become pregnant or carry a baby to term after previously given birth to a baby. Here's a hardship of women. The fertility window is much narrower for women than for men. Normally, a woman only releases one egg per monthly cycle and can only conceive during a few days of her cycle, up to and including the day of ovulation. Furthermore, a woman's fertility begins to decline sooner than a man's. Her fertility starts to decline in her late 20s, with more substantial decline by her late 30s. Fertility for men is less affected by age, but shows significant decline by late 30s. Here's a very tragic hardship. 700 to 900 women die from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes. This is in the U.S., and some 65,000 nearly die. Worldwide, of course, we'd be looking at different numbers. But I have just restricted my whole project to the U.S. It's big enough as it is. Now, I was shocked to learn that the United States ranks near the bottom of the world's wealthy countries when it comes to the number of women who die from complications of pregnancy and childbirth. So here's the U.S. rate, okay? Here's South Korea, Germany, UK, Australia, Sweden going down, and the U.S., it's going up at quite a significant rate. I was shocked that in our country with our good medical care, this is the case. So even worse, the U.S. is only, there are only a few countries where it has risen since 1990, including Zimbabwe and North Korea. So we in North Korea have rising maternal mortality rates, some partnership there. Now, this is a very severe problem for some women, postpartum depression, so much so that some women become suicidal or decide not to have any more children, or they experience the hardship of considerable challenges with breastfeeding. We could have a whole half-hour thing on that. And menopause, it happens in a woman's 40s or 50s. Thank you. I know people are looking. The physical symptoms can be very difficult, and the emotional symptoms can disrupt sleep, lower energy, or affect emotional health. Hysterectomy. It is estimated that 1 in every 3 women have had a hysterectomy by the time she turns 60. So the surgical removal of her uterus and other reproductive organs. Now, while the number of hysterectomies has declined substantially in recent years, medical investigators are concerned that women are victims of unnecessary hysterectomies, which are performed when non-surgical interventions would be preferable. All right, we'll buzz through quickly. Here's some other reproductive health concerns of women. Endometriosis, uterine fibroids, various kinds of gynecologic cancer, interstitial cystitis, you can look that one up. I had to look it up. Polycystic ovary syndrome. Then there's some diseases, non-reproductive issues, that affect women much more so than men. Multiple sclerosis, lupus, chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, osteoporosis, celiac disease. All right, breast cancer. There's a breast cancer gender gap. Women get breast cancer at a much higher rate than men. It's primarily, but men can get it. Women have done a wonderful job with awareness and support, fundraising, education, lobbying on behalf of themselves and other women. Here's the co-host of Good Morning America from some years ago. She had an aggressive form of breast cancer and decided to go public with her journey. She was 64 when she got it, and losing her hair and everything. So she's a poster child for breast cancer. Likewise, Angelina Jolie had a preventative double mastectomy because she had the gene that leads to, the gene mutation that leads to breast cancer. Now, it's primarily a disease of older women. The median age of diagnosis is 62. It's particularly aggressive when young women get it. And the survival rates have been terrific, particularly when it's caught early. And all women know that after a certain age you get mammograms and they can catch it and deal with it. We've got wonderful treatments. Now here's another gender gap that women have significantly higher rates of, and that's depression overall and in every age group. Now we've touched quickly on a number of hardships of women, many through the reproductive cycle of their lives. And I'd suggest a twofold response. One is compassion for women's sufferings and hardships. When you meet them and you hear one of these words or terms, just dig down a little bit and show compassion to her. And also gratitude for women's many contributions to the ongoing of the human race, enduring the challenges of childbearing, without which none of us would be sitting here, and for their many areas of contributions in the paid and volunteer segments of our society and our churches, and for ways women build and nurture community, to name just a few things. Okay, now we're going to look at gender gaps disadvantaging men. We're going to look at some of the physical and bodily hardships that men experience as men and see if we can have compassion and gratitude for men as we look at them, and to have balanced concern. Now, we've just looked at breast cancer, which primarily affects women. Prostate cancer is male-specific and exclusively affects men. Now, the NFL dedicated the month of October to raising awareness for breast cancer, which I found very interesting. Here are these macho football players, and they're kindly turning their attention to breast cancer. Now, they've moved on to the crucial catch, intercept cancer, and now they're going to focus on breast cancer, colorectal, and cervical. Two of them are exclusively women's cancer. What about prostate cancer? Who's going to focus on and give some attention to prostate cancer? It's so unknown that a lot of people can't even pronounce it. They say prostate cancer. And who can tell me the color of prostate cancer awareness or what month it is? So who's the poster? Tom Brady up there, awareness for prostate cancer. Anyway, there isn't a male equivalent of an Angelina Jolie on the prostate cancer posters of magazine, but why not? Why not? How about some woman getting up there and encouraging women to get their husbands to get tested? Especially it's for older men. Let's look at the stats. Breast cancer is the most common cancer in women. Prostate cancer is the #1 cancer in men. Look at the stats. They're similar. There are more deaths to breast cancer, but there's still tens of thousands of men who die of prostate cancer. So let's have sympathy for men facing prostate cancer, like we have widespread sympathy for women who have breast cancer. So here's a hardship that can be a side effect of prostate surgery and a severe blow to a man, certainly deserving of compassion, although, of course, the details will probably not be a matter of public knowledge if he's suffering impotence. Now, here's another hardship of man. Erectile dysfunction can be the source of considerable distress for men. It can be a lot harder to talk about than, say, breast reconstruction surgery for a woman. But ever since Viagra was approved by the FDA 20 years ago, erectile dysfunction has been regular in media advertising as well as a subject of jokes. Yet it's not funny for the sufferer and can be very hard on the man's self-image. Now, let's look at this, the life expectancy gender gap. The men, just by being men, have shorter lives than women. This is across all right, now let's look at this. What do you think of when you see this statement? There are more than 4 widows for every widower. Do you feel sorry for the woman left alone after many years of marriage? Of course our hearts should go out to her and the widows in our families and our communities. But do our sympathies also go out to the husband, the man, who 4 out of 5 times has died before his wife? Men die sooner than women. The life expectancy for women is almost 5 years longer than for men. 5 years fewer years of life for men. And it's across all racial and ethnic groups. I don't have Asians, so I looked and I got Korea. It's even more so in Korea. Look at that big gap. It's a very big gap. Every country, it's a big gap. So now, we've looked earlier at women's physical hardships. Are the health concerns of women recognized and being studied and being addressed in our country? Let me show you, there are dozens and dozens of federal level offices and divisions specifically devoted to women's health. These are just federal level programs I'm going to show you, not state level. Okay. Now, are the physical hardships, the health and longevity of men addressed in federal programs? What is the U.S. government doing to promote the health and longevity of our men? Now, this was the list of federal level male-only health programs that I could find. So I could not find any equivalent list of federal level programs. Now, surely there are programs, but we have a huge attention on women. There were efforts to get a bill through Congress some years ago to create an Office of Men's Health comparable to the Office of Women's Health, but that didn't pass. We do not, at the federal level, address men's health the way we do women's health. Even if our focus as a culture were primarily on women, one could argue that it's worth investing in trying to get men to live longer, so for the women's sake, so that they aren't alone as widows so many years. But let's try and lengthen men's lives for their own sake. Now let's press on with men's health. We've already touched on conditions that women are subject to more so than men, but these are not the conditions that most Americans die of. Almost half of Americans die of 2 big killers, heart disease and cancer. And these are the big gender gaps as well. Of the top 10 leading causes of death, the statistics are that men will die of 9 of them at significantly greater rates than women. Both men and women die of heart conditions, but men die 7 to 10 years earlier than women. So the ones in bold are the big ones, and you see over on the far right that 100 men die at 140%, their rate is 140% of women's rate. Likewise with cancer. The only exception is Alzheimer's. Women die of Alzheimer's at a greater rate than men. Now, I as a woman hope and pray for researchers on Alzheimer's, but also for all these other diseases too. Why are men dying of all these other causes at significantly greater rates than women? So this is something that we should have a national concern about. Here are the risk factors for heart attack, with heart issues being the #1 cause of death for both men and women. The list addresses men 45 and older, so you see tobacco, high blood pressure, all these things, but women 55 and older. Women have a significant 10-year protective factor in being women. Men have a significant hardship in being men. This just shows you the lines on the left are much longer than the lines on the right. So the different cancers in the different, those are the different ethnic and groups down the middle. So now let's turn to another hardship of men, death in the workplace. The probability that you'll be injured or killed on the job. Now, job safety has improved tremendously over the last century, but over 5,000 people died at work in the U.S. in 2016. Think about that. 5,000 people died on the job. More than 14 Americans dying every day. Let's see who those deaths are. Of the 20 jobs with the highest death rates, they're on average 93% male. So relatively safe occupations such as office work, education, and library occupations are roughly 3/4 women. Women work hard, but men do most of the physically hard, dangerous, dirty jobs in our society. This greater risk of dying in the workplace is a hardship of men in our society that is seldom recognized or appreciated. Now, these are the most dangerous jobs, okay? And down here is the percent male of all of these jobs, okay? You see it's mostly in the 90s, that are few in the high 70s, but these are mostly male jobs. Now, women make up 43% of the workforce, okay? So that's here. But they only make up 7% of the deaths in the workplace. I'm going to show you the 10 most dangerous jobs in 2015. Now again, I'm not blaming women that they aren't dying. The point is to be concerned. The point is, so Cindy, are you safe in the library? Okay. Good. I know. Okay. So only, these are the 10 most dangerous jobs. Logging. Okay, being a logging worker is one of the most daring and dangerous jobs out there. All right, forget the idea of leisurely fishing. Commercial fishing for a living is a dangerous job. Now, it's 100%, if you round. Say if there are 2 women commercial fishermen, then it would still round up to 100%. Now, have you seen this? This is the Fisherman's Memorial in Gloucester. It's a very scenic tourist attraction. I recommend that you go and get a picture while you're in the North Shore. But it commemorates 5,368 Gloucester men who have lost their lives at sea since 1623, a vivid reminder of the hazards of this occupation. And here are their names. Third most dangerous occupation is aircraft pilots, not commercial airline pilots. Think crop dusting, monitoring traffic, tracking criminals, testing new aircraft, flying passengers and cargo to areas not served by regular airlines, helping firefighting and rescuing injured people. Number 4, extracting resources from the ground or sea. Roofing, working at heights is always a dangerous thing to do. They can fall down from heights and break bones or die. OSHA tracks all injuries and deaths that are reported to them, and falling is a great source of injury and death in the workplace. Believe it or not, refuse collectors are number 6. Now that's Dan dumping our barrel and Giovanni in the back. That's our trash collectors. And since I've started this research, so for about a year and a half now, I've started noticing men in dangerous jobs who do the hard, dangerous, dirty work to make my life better. So I leave out cold drinks and snacks each week, and I usually go out, and I did this morning, today was our trash day, and greet the men, ask how they are, and thank them for their work, and urge them to be safe. And one of them showed up with a mask today, and Giovanni did, and I was glad because he was breathing all this stuff, and his nose was running and red and stuff like that. So it's nasty stuff they're dealing with. Number 7, mining machine operators. Truck drivers of all kinds face danger simply because they're out on the road with other moving vehicles. Now, surprisingly, farmers and ranchers, 25% of these are women, the largest percentage of women in any dangerous occupation. The latest technologies have made these occupations safer, but the transportation of heavy machinery and frequent contact with equipment causes the injuries and fatalities of this job, and getting trampled, bitten, kicked, or bucked are a few potential threats faced by agricultural workers. And this would be fairly obvious that this is a dangerous job. When we were without power last winter, 51 hours, I personally went out and thanked the linesmen who were restoring our power for us. Now, let's look at number 4 on this list. Accidents, okay, that's what we've looked at, is accidents. Now let's look at number 10. The number 10 cause of death is suicide. Women attempt suicide more, but men carry through far more often. The gender gap is that men take their own lives at over 3.5 times the rate of women. Women's suicide is rising, and the death of anybody by suicide is a terrible blow to the family members left behind. But men's rate is much higher. The rate of suicide is highest in middle age. In 2015, 7 out of the 10 suicides were white men. And here's Robin Williams, 121 per day, 44,000 per year, and most of them men. So this depicts the gender gap visually. This is a hardship that in particular men suffer, in particular white men, but also American Indian and Alaska Native men are particularly vulnerable to that. And another way of looking at this tragic statistic, you see the men's rate on top and the women's rate on the bottom. So when we see these statistics, we acquire more knowledge about how men too face hardships. Can we let this awareness into our hearts and hopefully make us more compassionate for that man and woman, and then translate into concrete action day to day? So for example, when I see, these were some men redoing our roads recently, and our water mains, they were replacing our water mains. So I went out of my way to talk with them, find out what their life is like. They came up from the Cape, and they had been staying in a motel in Peabody all week, and then they go back home for the weekend, working hard. So then I saw these men, and I thought, maybe before I started this research, men like this were just strictly invisible to me. I did not see them. I took them for granted. So then I started thinking, where are there some invisible women around me? And just as I was walking home, this was just a few blocks from our house, I saw a woman from my church taking care of her grandson. She's not being paid, but her work is challenging and tiring, and her contribution to the greater good is also significant and praiseworthy. Most of our caregivers are women, upwards of 75% are female, with an estimated economic value of $470 billion in 2013. So these unpaid caregivers are contributing greatly to the well-being of our society. Now we're going to turn to another gender gap that is brought, whenever I think I've finished this presentation, then I've got to update this very sad statistic. 100 of the perpetrators of mass shootings have been men. 3 were women, and 97% male. So 57% of the mass shootings were initiated by white males. So the response is always gun control, but other people are saying, well, and I'm not getting into that. I'm looking at underrepresented topics, but other people are saying that most of these men did not have a father in their life. So can we dig deeper and find out what's going on in our society? Now, with such bad news about men, what are we to think of men? Okay, a lot of bad news about men. But whenever we have a mass shooting or a natural disaster such as the hurricanes in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, the wildfires, or New England power outages, it's primarily men in great numbers who come forth as our first responders, including, this is the Las Vegas shooting last year. Here's 1 brave woman and 8 brave men. So the ratio who ran forward into the danger to try and protect and stop the shooter. So the ratio that you see here is similar to nationwide. On the far left is general employed population, and then you see EMTs, men are the blue, and then firefighters and police. So we appreciate the women who are in these fields, and we appreciate the men who are in these fields. So it's not a competition. Both can contribute. But to appreciate these people who take on a very dangerous job. Many unpaid volunteers who literally have jumped into the water to help. These are after our hurricanes. And men and sometimes women rescuing stranded people after the hurricanes. And the women are in the shelters feeding the meals. The men are rescuing. So both are contributing. So let's give the women thanks and praise and give the men thanks and praise too. Now I'm going to skip, we have a daughter in Sonoma County, and these are the firefighters, and statistically mostly men. These were the men replacing the wires, and Norman Rockwell portrait. First responders after a church massacre. Okay, so moving on now, education gender gap, different topic. We're so used to think of the term gender gap as something women are not doing as well as men. We see things like this. Somehow women are being disadvantaged in STEM fields. Men are dominating the STEM fields. Here are a number of targeted government programs for education, all dedicated to women. Okay? Now, one would think, looking at these programs for women and girls, that girls and women are falling behind boys and girls and in need of serious remediation. All right, I'll go through this. The exact opposite is the case. Boys drop out of high school at a significantly greater rate than girls across all states and ethnic and racial lines. Boys are particularly at risk. The education gender gap is that boys and men are not doing as well as girls and women, a situation quite different from some places in the developing world. So I want to keep repeating, this is about the U.S. If we were talking about some other countries, it's the boys who get the education and not the girls. And so completely different situation. Here are two very special little first graders, two of my grandsons. Boys suffer from learning disabilities more than girls. The differences between boys and girls begin in the early grades. Boys have higher rates of ADHD, higher prevalence of reading difficulties. Dyslexia is 2 to 3 times as common as males and females. Most of their elementary teachers are not their same gender. Many boys are being raised by a single mother and lack male role models in their lives. The gender gap continues through high school. Nationally, 7% fewer young men graduated from high school than young women. Even in Massachusetts, 4% fewer didn't finish high school. And these are all the different states. The highest at the top is D.C., bottom is Vermont, but even in Vermont there's a gender gap. The gap continues through college. Last year there were 20 million students expected to attend American colleges, another 4 million in graduate or professional schools. Females were expected to account for about 56% of those attending, and 44% were males. A significant gap disfavoring men and favoring women. And this we see over time, how it's changed. Now we're delighted for the educational opportunities, and I'm standing here as one who's privileged, very privileged in that regard. But if we in the Christian community are to care equally for women and men, as we celebrate how far women and girls have come, what about the state of our boys and men? Here's another graphic depicting the college gender gap. It's a 25% male-female gender gap. Now I'm going to go quickly here, but we've got even at the associate, bachelor's, master's, and now even at the doctoral and PhD level, women are getting more of the degrees than men. It's surpassed 50%. So, and women surpass men in 7 of the 11 academic fields tracked, and by significant percentages, there are only 4 fields where men exceed women in getting degrees: business, engineering, math, computer science, and physical sciences, basically the STEM fields. That's true at undergraduate and even at the PhD level. Women earn 52.2% of all the degrees awarded. So there are numerous government programs to try and get women into STEM fields. We hear that all the time, but we don't have any government programs to try and get more men into elementary education, trying to incentivize men to go into some of these fields that are dominated by women. So where's the balance there? Women out-achieve men in all racial and ethnic groups. So that's we could dig down deeper. We're flying at 30,000 feet here. Now, here's another thing that we often hear about. This is well-resourced in the public media. The earnings gender gap, also called the pay gap or the wage gap. It's probably the most common thing that comes to mind when you hear the term gender gap. And is it true that women have equal education and unequal pay? We've seen how well American women are doing in college and beyond. Why aren't they surpassing men in pay? So what is going on? Now, this is how the earnings gap is stated. Women earn 80 cents for every dollar a man earns for doing the same work. So they take everyone who is working 35 or more hours a week for a full year, find the median or middle income for women, find the median income for men, and divide. That's how you get the figure that's often quoted, 78, 80, 83 cents to the dollar for the man. But this number does not say that men and women are doing the same thing. It doesn't say that they're working the same amount of time, the same hours during the day, or the same days of the week. The way this figure is often used is to assume and suggest that pay disparities are primarily created by outright discrimination against women by employers or by women's lack of negotiating skills for higher salaries. Now, nothing about the wage gap is simple, so let's drill down a little bit because this is a source of ongoing resentment. It comes up all the time in discussions. It's presented in so many ways. It gains a subtleness of fact just by being repeated but not being looked at carefully. Many think that women earn less because male employers are deliberately discriminating against them and paying them less for doing the same work. So if this is true, it would be very difficult for my project to try and encourage people to have look with generosity at men as well as at women if men are deliberately oppressing the other sex. So let's dig a little deeper now. Some writers addressing the earnings gap think that women who want to make a lot of money should not be focusing on the pay gap statistics, but instead getting into higher paying fields. Now, it is strictly illegal to pay a woman less than a man for doing the same job. It's been illegal since, I think, 1963. The U.S. government has and will prosecute such cases with serious consequences for the employer. Is this true? Women like men, only cheaper. Now, Warren Farrell wrote a book, Why Men Earn More: The Startling Truth Behind the Pay Gap and What Women Can Do About It. This is a very thorough treatment of the earnings gap. He says, yes, men do earn more, but not for doing the same exact work, but for 25 different workplace choices that men and women make. He suggests that men's choices lead to them making more money. Women's choices may lead them to having better lives. He was on the board of the National Organization for Women for a number of years in New York City, and he strongly opposed this inequality between men and women. Then he started asking himself, if an employer had to pay a man $1 for the same work a woman would do for 59 cents, why would anyone hire a man? The company that hired all men would soon go out of business, and the company that hired all women would soon put them out of business. So he dug down and concluded that it's not men versus women, but it's choices that mothers and fathers make as they have children. Now, here are some of the different choices. Women make different college major choices. Women and men make different job choices. However, never married women earn 17% more than never married men who have never had children. When a couple has a baby, here are some of the different choices that fathers in dark green and mothers in light green make in order to care for their little one. So they reduce work hours, they take significant time off, quit their job, or turn down a promotion. Women will more often do those things when they have a baby in order to care for the little one. Now, there are 18 different decisions that Warren Farrell analyzed that men and women, that some men make, that end up with them making more money than women. Now, if a woman wants to make more money, she can make some of these decisions too. So let's look at some of these. Work more hours per week. If you work more than 35 hours, you're going to make more money than somebody who works 35 hours. Major in technology or hard sciences rather than art history or dance therapy. Work in a field that is hazardous. We've already talked about that. Work in an exposure profession. If you're outside, among the jobs that require little education, those that expose you to sleet and heat pay more than those are indoor and neat. FedEx deliverer versus receptionist. All right, think of firefighters and linesmen. In most fields with higher pay, you can't psychologically check out at the end of the day. So corporate attorney rather than a librarian, for example. Now, here's another thing. Work in a field that is less fulfilling than a field you would choose to work in if you had won the lottery. So you might not work in your dream job if you want to make more money. Also, think about the hours that you work. Graveyard shift is going to pay more than school hours. And work in a field that requires constant updating of your skills, such as computer science or engineering rather than art history. Commute further to work. Men often commute further than women, often for family reasons. So the woman can be home when the kids get home after school. This opens up more job possibilities. You could work in Boston and Cambridge rather than in Hamilton, for example. So people who are getting higher pay are more willing to move to an undesirable location at the company's behest. If you travel more than 5 days on your job, be an international travel rep, international sales rep rather than a local sales rep, for example. Work on commission. Work in the public sector. Work in the public sector usually pays less than in the private sector. And women tend to work more in the public sector than the private sector. And don't take years off. But 43% of working women leave their jobs to start families, after which only 40% of these women return to full-time work, and then they will be several steps behind the men who didn't take time off. But couples need to weigh what is best for them and for their children and to create the best lives for themselves. And they may decide to flip it. It may be that the woman will work and the man will stay home. So, but just to kind of look more carefully at what is going on here. So, having looked at 15 decisions people make in the workplace that lead to greater pay, when a young woman hears men earn $1 for each 80 cents that a woman earns, it could trigger for that woman 15 paths to higher pay rather than one path to victimhood. Fathers don't usually take the years off that mothers do. They end up making more money. And women have often learned how to have a better life and have more control over their lives, to become more the person that they'd like to be. So perhaps they experience greater occupational fulfillment and live longer than men. Now, let's look quickly here at a very different kind of gender gap between men and women. Is there a gender gap in the church? Now, many people, I'd love to have a discussion, but we're fast here. When I've asked this before, some have mentioned more men than women in church leadership. Women not given as much authority and opportunities to preach, not ordained to equally high levels of authority, and the need for more women pastors. There has been a rise of women in church leadership in the United States, But what is happening in the pews? Church attendance in the U.S. is declining in many denominations. And there is a male-female gap that is rarely talked about. I've read stacks of books in my program on the pros and the cons of women in leadership. What does the Bible say about women in leadership? Women as preachers, blah, blah, blah. Stacks of books. That's well-resourced. That discussion is well-resourced. But I've heard virtually nothing on this. There's a male-female gap that's rarely talked about. The majority of attendees in a typical American church are women. The typical U.S. congregation, and again, this is U.S., not countries where some of you are from. Typical U.S. congregation is 61% female and 39% male. Count up in your church and just see what it's like. Perhaps in addition to wanting to encourage women to fully use their gifts in our churches, whatever that looks like in your particular church or denomination, we should also think about the men who are missing from our pews and how can we increasingly be both female and male friendly and achieve gender balance so that men want to come to church on Sunday and not have sports be their only religion. The gender gap has existed for a long time. Cotton Mather commented on this in 17th century Boston. But there's nothing inherent about the Christian faith that is more feminine than masculine. God became incarnate as a man. Jesus chose 12 male apostles. Men's absence is particularly noteworthy given that men, as well as women, were a strong force in the early church. Maybe when we hear the term church gender gap, we'll also think about the male-female disparity in the pews and see if there are ways that we can welcome men to the church while welcome men while also encouraging women. Now, briefly, objectification of women is a hardship that women bear. We all know that women's bodies are used to sell everything. But do you know that men are also objectified? Do you know that? All right, this man's body is being objectified in advertising and media. All right, the tagline here, the only thing better than dressing is undressing. This is an ad for salad dressing. Okay, most of the stuff I saw I could not show. This is air freshener and tequila. Now, what effect does this have on women, to see their bodies objectified, and this is the standard that people look at, but what effect does this have on men, that these are the images that women are looking at and that women expect men to look like that? So it's a problem for both of us. Now, quickly, citizenship obligation, gender gap. Service in war. Women have historically been exempt from this. Women may serve in any area, including combat, but that's a choice. It's never in our history been an obligation. Men still have to register with a selective service at age 18. Women never have. Men traditionally have assumed the protector role, and our country has considered women as too valuable to send into war. We need more women to produce the next generation than we do men, or it may be chivalry. But traditionally, women have gotten the right of citizenship without any obligation, no obligation for 2 years of community service or anything. Women got the right to vote in 1920. Men got it sooner, but there were many groups in our history who did not have the right to vote. So it was property owners, and black men got the right to vote, and later women. So Chinese didn't have the right to vote, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been the growth of the franchise. All the other men who've gotten the right to vote have had selective service obligation. So women have done great things in wartime. But anyway, when I realized this, I started noticing war memorials around. This is in Wenham, and you look on the names, and it's all men's names. Vietnam Memorial, 58,310 men and 8 women. The women didn't die in combat. I think it was helicopter crashes and They were nurses, things like that. So anyway, this is a great sacrifice that men have made. Now, we could have a big discussion about war and we should be more peace-loving and blah, blah, blah. The point is, this is our history. Some of you here have served and are serving our country, and I want to express my gratitude toward you. Here's a courtesy gender gap on the Titanic. Back in a very, quote-unquote, patriarchal age, it was assumed that women and children would be rescued first. John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in the world, stood on the deck while steerage-class women were loaded into the lifeboats. Here are the statistics, okay? Here are other hardships that are disproportionately male. We can see ways that men bring on some of these hardships on themselves: alcoholism, homelessness, drug addiction, victims of violent crime, homicide victims, pornography addiction. And we also can have compassion on their suffering, even as the father in Jesus' parable. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. Here's two more gender gaps. We know there's a black-white legal gender gap, that a young white man is likely to get a lesser crime than a black young man, even for the same crime. But the same is true for men and women. Men commit more crimes, but when a man and a woman commit a crime equally together, the man is much more likely to receive a longer sentence, the woman the shorter sentence, or she will be released on probation. She is favored because she is a woman. He is treated as more guilty, even though they've done the same crime together. She may be asked to testify against him in exchange for being released, not the reverse. Men are 15 times as likely to be incarcerated as women are. Prosecutors treat women and men differently, and the gender gaps widen at every stage of the process. So we hear so much about women's reproductive rights, the right of the woman to control her own body. That's another whole discussion, okay? But a father has no reproductive or legal rights if his wife or partner decides to abort their unborn child. He cannot stop it. He cannot, yet even if he is tricked into fathering a child, whether he is married to her or not, he can be legally obligated to support the child for the next 18 years. So let's turn to a terrible hardship that no doubt all of our hearts and minds think of as the hardship of women. This is my last hardship, and this is going to shock you, I think, a little bit. But we all know that abuse is physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions, threats, or action that influence another person. Any behavior that would frighten, intimidate, terrorize, manipulate, hurt, humiliate, blame, or wound somebody. Now, it's not a simple matter to determine how many people are suffering from violence at the hands of family members. Police departments feed crime statistics data to the federal government. A lot of domestic abuse is not reported. A woman may fear that if she turns herself or her husband or partner, if she turns to the police for help, the husband will find out and she'll be worse off. Such women are often hidden from sight among us, maybe even in the seminary community. We're much more aware now. We have many more avenues for people to seek help. When I go for my annual physical, maybe you too, are you safe at home? They always ask that. Are you safe at home? My husband gets asked that too. So, I don't know, are you safe at home? But anyway. Now, this is a local organization that, I'm going to skip that. The posters, statistics, and articles we read and talk about, it talks about violence against women. But I found that there are other victims too, and I hope you'll bear with me as I share some of what I have been reading. We have archival versus survey data. So the police reports, as I've said, would be primarily women seeking help. Most men, if a woman hits him, with a frying pan or something, he's probably not going to trot down to the Hamilton Police Department and report her. He would be humiliated to do so. And if he goes to the ER for, stitches, he's not going to report his wife. The woman is more likely to report than the man is. Survey data is different, though. You all have done an anonymous survey. I do not know that that's your paper when I read it, okay? When they do anonymous surveys, they get much more report of men being abused by their women partner. So the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey was a government-sponsored survey from 18,000 interviews. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been physically abused by an intimate partner. That's what that survey came up with. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 5 men have been, 7 men have been severely physically abused by an intimate partner. Okay, I was startled and skeptical. Jack was startled and skeptical. Terminology matters in how we see a problem. Do we frame the problem as violence against women? Or do we frame it as domestic violence or intimate partner violence, so that we make it known to our men as well as to our women that, yes, sometimes men are abused. Sometimes boys are abused by parents, sometimes girls, sometimes men, with a lot of strong men. Sometimes they found that it's mutual battering. They batter each other. So I think our terminology should change. All these statistics are real people, real sufferers. And we are just about done here. This is good. I'd like to use the term intimate partner violence to frame this problem as a hardship of women and also a hardship of men when they're the ones abused. Now, I found a substantial body of studies presenting evidence of mutuality in violence, that females abuse males as well as males abusing females. I was looking for graphics to put up here. Now, you've seen stuff like this. Every 9 seconds, a woman in the U.S. is the victim of domestic violence. But that might suggest to the reader that it is women who are the primary or exclusive victims of domestic violence. Or if the man is the victim, it's because he had it coming. He deserved it. Have you heard that? That a woman was acting in self-defense. Sometimes that's true. But why do we just automatically assume that the man is guilty and that the woman is innocent? Can we be more objective and compassionate toward both? Or that he's so much bigger and that she couldn't possibly hurt him. A great big man knows his strength. He may go like that. You know, he knows that he's not going to use his hand again. He's been so conditioned in our culture not to hit a woman, but women have not been similarly encouraged. And you can look online, and they've done studies where they do a setup, and they find that people will intervene if a man is abusing a woman, but they won't intervene. They'll, in fact, laugh if a woman is abusing a man. So then I found this graphic, which was quite startling. Now, I'm not in a position to comment on how accurate these statistics are, but I'll take you into some of the studies. I'm just going to, because we're at where we need to stop. There are many, many government programs working on behalf of women, violence against women at the federal level. We don't even hear about violence against men in a domestic situation. There's nothing for men. But all these places for women to go. We have the sports heroes coming out against violence against women. And violence against women, no, violence against everyone. Then I came across this 32-page bibliography. This man has devoted decades of his career. I've written to him, and he sent me his most recent bibliography. He's still continuing his work. He's out in California, references examining assaults by women on their spouse or male partners. So he is trying to gather all these studies together, even women killing their partners. So anyway, a woman can do anything a man can do, and violence against women and solve only half the problem. Now, we are at the time where I need to give you the post-test, but let me just, if you're interested, I can send you this bibliography. I won't take your time. We've looked at hardships of women and hardships of men. Will this knowledge translate into increased compassion for one another? We women know how essential we are for the continuance of the human race. Will we express gratitude to women? And will we also express our gratitude to the men around us for all the hard, dangerous, dirty jobs they do, for the many good things they do that aren't hard, dangerous, dirty jobs, but to appreciate one another's hardships and one another's contributions, and to try and have a church community, a Christian community, where there's no division in the body and we have the same care for one another. Thank you. Now, would you, your last obligation before you get your money is to briefly fill out a post-test. Now, if any of you filled out the pre-test that I emailed out, I changed it a little bit last night. So could you snag a pre-test from there and fill out that pre-test with your same number? So the pre-test that I emailed out, some of the questions got changed. So just right now, do the post-test, put your number on it, and then turn it in the back. Thank you.